In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the different ways that you can use to get information into your programs. So let's get started. So there are a variety of different ways that you can get information into your programs in MATLAB. Specifically in this video, we're going to discuss three. First is one that you've already been using, and that's just creating hard-coded variables in your MATLAB program that have some value. Next, we could use what are called input statements, which allow you to prompt the user to enter a value of some kind, and then that value gets stored into a variable in MATLAB. Or you can use what we call menu statements, which is actually going to display a separate window with a couple of different options, and the user will have to select which of those options they want to use. Okay, so let's start off with the one that we already know, using hard-coded variables. All right, so far, whenever you've needed to get a value into your program, you've simply created a variable. All right, so we can do things like create a variable x that stores a number, in this case 5, or we could create a variable maybe called pizza that stores the variable or the value pepperoni. In this case, is a string instead of a number. All right, so we've been doing this all along. But what's the problem with this? Why don't we use hard-coded variables all the time? We already know how to use them. Well, there's a couple of reasons why we wouldn't want to use this. First, it doesn't allow the user to change or choose a different value. Okay? If the user wanted to change a value, they would have to go into your code and change that line where you're creating this variable initially. Right? Generally, you don't want to have somebody else going in and messing around with your code, because they could potentially delete something else, which is going to be important for having your code run correctly, and then your code doesn't run correctly. Okay, so it doesn't allow the user to select something on their own. They have to use those values that you specified. Right, which ultimately then means that your program is only useful for that one specific case. Okay, if you wanted to have your program do something different, you would have to go in and again change the values of those variables manually. Okay. Probably the most important thing, though, is why you can't use hard-coded variables all the time, is that you may not know what the values are that are needed beforehand. Okay, so there may be situations where you want to have the user give you a value. So for instance, you've seen some of those different things online where you can enter your name and it creates your gangster name or your Star Wars name or whatever it might be, right? Those people didn't know what your name was ahead of time. You have to be able to enter your name. Okay, so they couldn't have hard-coded your name into a variable in the code that runs behind the scenes on those websites. Right? Same way, you can't necessarily have hard-coded variables all the time in your MATLAB scripts. So instead of using hard-coded variables, we can instead make use of input statements. So an input statement, like I mentioned before, allows the user to specify a value based on a prompt that you'll be giving them, and this will all occur inside the command window. Right, so the basic syntax we have for the input statement is shown right here. Okay. So we have a variable, so this is where the value that the user entered is going to be stored. We have the input, which is the keyword that tells MATLAB we're using an input statement. And then we have the message that we want to display. This is the prompt asking the user, hey, this is what we want you to be able to input for us. So the version of the input statement that we just saw works really well for numbers. It doesn't work so well if we wanted to say, like the example I gave before, enter a name or a string of some kind. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. What's going to happen if I try to do this? I have an input statement here. I have a variable called letter. I have the message, please enter a letter. So it goes off and enters my prompt. And let's say I type in the value of A. Right? What we would expect to have happen is that A would be stored into my variable letter. Unfortunately, if we did this, we would end up with an error because MATLAB's going to think that A is a variable because it's looking for a number. If instead of having an input statement read in a number, we wanted to have it read in a letter or a word or something like that, we have to modify our input statement slightly. And basically all we have to do is we have to add on this second option here for the input statement, in single quotation marks, the S. And that tells MATLAB the thing that you're going to be reading in is now a string, S for string, instead of a number. Now let's take a look at a couple examples so we can have an idea of how the input statement works. So let's say I type this command into the command window. You could actually go ahead and do this if you want to pause the video. Okay, so we have radius equals input, please enter the radius. Okay, so our variable is radius, our message is please enter the radius, and it's an input statement. So if I were to hit enter, what I would see is my message would pop up on the command window, please enter the radius, and let's say I typed in the value of 5. That value of 5 is going to be stored into my variable radius, so if I then did a display statement and tried to display the radius, I would get a value of 5. Okay. Similarly, if I now had this input statement, my variable is now called name, my message is please enter your name, and notice that I'm now asking MATLAB to read in a string because I have the second input argument there for the input command for S. Okay, so if I hit enter, my prompt would again be entered, please enter your name. I could type in a name, let's say I'm William Wallace. Right, so now William Wallace, the string is going to be stored into my variable name, and if I were to display my name, it would come up as William Wallace. The third option we have for getting input values into our program, at least the ones that we're going to be talking about in this video, is the menu statement. Okay, so like I mentioned before, the menu statement brings up a separate window with a set of predefined choices and allows the user to select from one of those choices that are specified. Okay, so it's going to create a new window, and actually those choices are going to be made available to the user through a set of buttons. Okay, so the menu statement takes the following form. Again, looks kind of similar to the input statement, where we have a variable which defines where a value is going to be stored based on what the user selects. Our keyword is now menu instead of input. We still have a message that we're going to display to the user to prompt them for what they're supposed to do. But now we have a list of options, and these are what the names are for the different buttons that are going to be displayed to the user. So we saw with the input statement, what is actually stored into the variable is the value or the word or whatever it is that the user typed in. So the question is, what is actually stored into our variable when the user presses one of these buttons, right? They're not actually typing anything in, so what's actually going to be stored? Well, the way that the menu statement works is that each of our options, or each of those buttons, is given a number, and based on which button the user presses, the number for that button is stored. Okay? And the way that those numbers are assigned is that the first button has a value of 1, the second button has a value of 2, and so on. So we count up by 1, starting with 1. So when the user presses, let's say they press the button for option 2, the value of 2 will be stored into our variable. Alright, so again, let's take a quick look at an example of a menu statement and see how this would work. So here I have a menu statement, which again, you can type these into your command window if you want and try them out yourselves. But we have a variable lunch, and then in our menu, our message is place your order, and we have 4 options: hamburger, pizza, taco, or salad. So I guess we're going to be selecting what we want to have for lunch. Okay, so if I were to run this, what you would see come up is this window. Okay, so we have our message there at the top, place your order, and then we have 4 buttons, each button corresponding to one of the options that we specified. So now I would be able to click on one of those buttons. Okay, so each of those buttons corresponds to a number, right? The first button has a number of 1, the second button has a number of 2, and the order of the buttons is how they are listed in our menu statement. So when I press, let's say, hamburger, the value of 1 gets stored into my variable lunch. If I pressed taco, the value 3 would be stored into my variable lunch. And that's how I can then allow the user to make selections. I would have to have something inside my code then that takes the value out of lunch and then does something with it. Maybe we have some code that creates a hamburger or creates a taco. Don't know how you're going to do that in MATLAB, but maybe it's possible. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully you've now learned a little bit about some of the different ways that you can get values into your program and make them a little bit more dynamic.